It had been 10 long years since Mark last stood by his mother's grave. Life had gotten in the way, work, moving to another city, the everyday distractions that somehow made the years slip by. But today, guilt and longing brought him back. With flowers in hand and memories heavy in his heart, he approached the weathered tombstone, the silence around him almost deafening. He knelt, brushing away the leaves that had gathered, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have come sooner." The air felt unusually still, and a chill ran down his spine as he shared with her the milestones she'd missed. His promotion, his engagement, the child she would never meet. He didn't expect an answer, of course. How could he? But just as he began to stand, something made him freeze. A sudden light tap on his shoulder. His breath caught. Was it the wind? A falling branch? Slowly he turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. What or who could it be? The graveyard was empty when he arrived, wasn't it? His mind raced as he struggled to make sense of the moment. And then in that quiet cemetery, something happened that would change everything. Mark's heart thudded as he turned, his breath catching in his throat. Behind him stood an older man, his face lined with years and eyes filled with something Mark couldn't quite place: sorrow, curiosity, maybe even recognition. The man's weathered hands trembled slightly as he clutched a small notebook. "I didn't mean to startle you," the man said softly, his voice carrying an unusual calmness for someone who had appeared out of nowhere. Mark studied him, trying to piece together how this stranger could have walked up so quietly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but guarded. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the grave and then back at Mark, as though measuring his response. "I come here often," he finally said. "Your mother, she was someone special." Mark blinked, confused. He'd never seen this man before in his life, yet something about his presence felt unsettlingly familiar. "How do you know my mom?" Mark asked, his words sharp with urgency. The man hesitated, a flicker of emotion passing over his face. "There are things you don't know," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "Things she didn't want you to know. Until now." Mark felt the ground beneath him shift, not physically, but in the way his reality suddenly felt less solid. His mom, keeping secrets, it didn't make sense. She had always been his anchor, the one person he could trust completely. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Who are you, and why would my mom keep anything from me?" The man sighed, his grip tightening on the notebook, as if it contained answers too heavy to share. "I can't explain everything, not here," he said, glancing around the cemetery, as though the graves themselves were listening. "But she wanted you to know the truth eventually. She made me promise to wait until the time was right." Mark's frustration boiled over. The time was right. It's been 10 years. She's gone. "If you know something, you need to tell me now." His words echoed through the stillness, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he opened the notebook, flipping through pages filled with faded handwriting. "She left this for you," he said, holding it out. Mark stared at the notebook, unsure whether to reach for it. His mind raced with questions. What could his mom have possibly written that this stranger was holding on to? And why now? The answers felt just out of reach, yet closer than ever. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the notebook, as if touching it might unleash something he wasn't ready to face. His pulse raced and his thoughts spiraled. What could his mom have written that required a stranger to deliver it, years after she was gone? Slowly, he reached out and took the notebook, the worn leather cool against his fingertips. The man stepped back, watching him with an unreadable expression. Mark flipped to the first page, his mother's familiar handwriting staring back at him. The sight of it sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. Grief, love, confusion. The words on the page were addressed to him. Asterisk, my dearest Mark, if you're reading this, it means the time has come for you to know the truth. I've carried this secret my whole life, hoping you'd never have to. But I can't keep it hidden anymore, asterisk. His breath caught as he read further, his hands trembling. The letter spoke of a man she had once trusted, someone who had betrayed her in ways Mark could hardly comprehend. His mind reeled as fragments of his childhood came flooding back, pieces that now seemed to fit a puzzle he didn't know existed. What is this about? Mark demanded, looking up at the stranger. The man's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. Your mom was protecting you, Mark. She knew you'd have questions one day, but the answers, they come with a price. Mark's chest tightened as the man gestured toward the grave. It all started here, he said, and it's not over yet. Mark's head swam with questions as the stranger's words sank in. What do you mean, it's not over yet? He asked, his voice edged with frustration. The man hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more, then motioned for Mark to follow him. There's something you need to see, he said quietly. Against his better judgment, Mark found himself trailing the man deeper into the cemetery, the notebook clutched tightly in his hand. They stopped at a gravestone a few rows over, one that looked older and more worn than his mother's. The man pointed to the name etched into the stone. Mark squinted in the dim light, his heart nearly stopping when he read the inscription. It was his last name, but not his mother's first name. Who is this? Mark demanded, though a gnawing sense of dread already churned in his gut. The man's face was grim. Your father, he said simply. Mark froze, the words hitting him like a freight train. His father? That couldn't be right. His dad had left when he was a baby, never to be heard from again, or so he'd been told. This doesn't make any sense, Mark whispered, his voice cracking. The man glanced back at him, his expression heavy with something deeper than sympathy. What you've been told isn't the whole story, he said. Your father didn't just leave. He was running from something far bigger than you realize. Mark's chest tightened as the stranger continued, his words unraveling everything Mark thought he knew. And now, Mark, it's catching up to you. Mark's mind raced, his grip tightening on the notebook, as if it could somehow anchor him in the storm of revelations. What was he running from? Mark demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The man sighed deeply, the weight of the truth etched into his every movement. Your father, he got involved with dangerous people, people who don't forgive or forget. He thought by disappearing, he could protect you and your mom. But the past doesn't stay buried forever. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. Why would my mom keep this from me? He asked, his voice breaking. The man gave him a sad smile. She wanted you to have a normal life, free from fear. She hoped the danger died with your father. He paused, then added, but it didn't. Before Mark could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. He turned sharply, his stomach dropping as two shadowy figures emerged from the darkness. You shouldn't have come back here, one of them said, their voice cold and laced with menace. Mark's heart raced as the man beside him stepped forward. You're here for me, not him, he said firmly, shielding Mark. Mark's confusion deepened. What's going on? He demanded. The man glanced back at him, urgency in his eyes. Your father wasn't the only one keeping secrets. I made a promise to your mother to protect you, no matter the cost. Before Mark could process what was happening, the stranger thrust the notebook back into his hands. Go, he said sharply. Read everything she wrote. It'll explain everything. But you have to leave now. Mark stumbled backward, torn between staying to find answers and fleeing to safety. As he ran, the last thing he heard was the man's voice shouting, "Don't let them take the notebook." But just as Mark reached his car, he opened the book again, and tucked in its final pages was something he hadn't noticed before, a photograph of his mother, standing next to the man who had just risked everything for him. Beneath it, written in her handwriting, were the words, "Asterisk, he's your real father." Mark sat in his car, the weight of the photograph and the words beneath it pressing down on him like a tidal wave. His hands trembled as he traced his mother's handwriting. The truth finally laid bare. The man who had just saved him, the man who had carried this secret for years, he wasn't just a stranger. He was his father. Everything began to click into place. The familiar way the man had looked at him, the deep sorrow in his eyes, and the unwavering promise to protect him. Mark felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: shock, betrayal, sadness, and, strangely, gratitude. His mother had kept this secret to shield him from the darkness of their past, and now he understood the lengths she had gone to give him a chance at a normal life. As he drove away from the cemetery, the notebook resting on the passenger seat, Mark knew his life would never be the same. But he also felt something unexpected: hope. His mom's love and sacrifice had carried him this far, and now it was up to him to carry her legacy forward. With the truth finally out, he could start piecing together a future built on both forgiveness and strength.